This is Amerigo. Is the Gospel of John a forgery? Two of the world's leading biblical scholars on John seem to think so. Let's see what their arguments look like and if they hold up. Hello, everyone. I'm going to do a quick review of the video was posted by Bart Ehrman on his channel, Bart D. Ehrman, on the question of whether the Gospel of John a forgery. I've linked the original video in the description below. It's an excellent video, and I'm using it here under fair use, so I'm trying not to steal the entire thing and just want to do commentary on the video, but I highly recommend everybody to watch the entire video because it's very informative. Anyone who's kind of interested in the scholarly aspects of New Testament textual criticism. His guest is Hugo Mendez, who's a colleague of his at University of North Carolina. And I don't know much about Professor Mendez, but he's very impressive in this video. One of his research interests listed on his bio page at UNC is Johannine Literature, and you can definitely tell he knows his stuff from his discourse on this video. I'm going to I want to kind of introduce the topic a little bit, so we'll start with that. But I also want to really hone in on at some point the central question that this video says is presenting, which is the Gospel of John a forgery? Now that's kind of covered at the latter portion of the video. The first 2/3 or so are really kind of an introduction to how the Gospel of John, the structure and its and what the narrator is telling you about the gospel. Just a brief background on the Gospel of John. John is considered the last of the four canonical Gospels to have been written. The traditional dating is at the end of the first century, somewhere in the year 90, maybe year 95. Although I think scholars recognize there's material concluded in John that dates earlier, probably to before the year 70. The gospel has been attributed to an author named John. The gospel itself does not specify who this John is. In fact, the gospel itself never says that the author is John. That has been the tradition of the church, that the gospel is written by John. The majority opinion during the early years of the church, and the majority opinion to Christians today, is that the author is John, the son of Zebedee, who's referred to in the other three canonical gospels, as well as in some of the Pauline epistles. The oldest surviving fragment from the Gospel of John that we have is about a postage size piece of papyri that has 3 lines from John's chapter 18 and on one side, and 2 lines from John on the back side. This is the so-called Ryland's Library Papyrus P52. It's been dated from anywhere from the very late 1st century all the way into the 3rd century. I think today the kind of orthodox dating is anywhere from the year 125 to the year 175. It should also be noted that the Gospel of John has been traditionally associated with epistles written around the same time period attributed to a person named John, as well as the book of Revelation, which is internally attributed to John. These together comprise what's known as the Johannine Literature. So we'll jump in here with kind of just a little bit of an introduction as to who the author is. I think before we jump in, I do want to discuss very briefly what is a forgery. It's a question that is addressed in the video. I think, if you take the term forgery completely, I know Bart Ehrman's written an entire book, popular book, about the concept of forgery, particularly in the New Testament. If you take, forgery outside of New Testament scholarship and just kind of ask yourself, and what is a common person understand a forgery to be? I think generally people understand the concept of forgery is it's a document or work of some kind, typically an art piece of artwork or perhaps a book, a manual, where it has been created with the illusion of the true author or artist behind the work being a particular person, but it's created by a different person in order to deceive the recipients or users of this um, piece of art or manuscript. So the classic example, obviously, is doing a painting that's either an exact replica or in the style of a famous artist, signing the artist's name to make it appear that it's a genuine work of the artist, but the entire thing has been created by a different person exclusively for the purpose of deceiving the public and deceiving the buyer. So that's what we kind of typically think of what a forgery is. I think in the context of manuscripts and writings, what we would understand a forgery to be is when a work has been created and signed, I would argue. Now, I think they're going to make an argument later on in this video that you don't actually need a signature or a false signature on the work, or at a minimum, I'd say you need a false claim. So you need the work to somehow expressly purport to be by a certain person, a famous person, a person of some repute that would give the work some sort of value. But in fact, it's not created by that person. It's created by an entirely different person, and really part of the reason for it is to trick the readers, in the case of a writing, into thinking that that a different person, the person of stature, has composed this work. So this gets a little bit tricky in the case of some of these New Testament texts that Bart Ehrman wants to argue are forgeries. And then this goes to another issue. The Gospel of John, as you read it, it never in the actual text of the document itself identifies the author as quote unquote John. It never says this is John writing this work. As you'll see in the early part of this discussion, which is about to follow here, the narrative is associated with, although not entirely clear that it's penned by. It purports to be the story of the testimony of a character known as the disciple who Jesus loved, or the beloved disciple, has been called throughout the ages. That particular person is never specifically identified in the text, so it's left a little bit, it's not a little bit, but left ambiguous to the later generations to figure out who this was. I think early generation of Christians have identified this beloved disciple as John, the son of Zebedee, who's kind of a more prominent figure in the synoptic gospel accounts, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. John, the son of Zebedee, does not really have an appearance, specific appearance in the Gospel of John as John, son of Zebedee, which is, I think, one of the reasons that John, the son of Zebedee, has been identified as the author or associated with the Gospel. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we get into it, but it kind of, like, as a more kind of a basic fundamental question, as we enter this kind of the topic, we need to ask ourselves, can this even be a forgery if the work itself never says that John is the one who composed it, if John didn't do it? Because the work never says it was composed by John. Now, I guess you could say there's definitely an argument to be made that if this beloved disciple, if this gospel is not based upon the testimony of the blood of the disciple, is it a forgery? I think the answer to that question is probably yes. It's an interesting way to frame it, but I think the answer to that question would be yes, is that if the person who actually composed this gospel is not purporting to give you the testimony of the beloved disciple and kind of fakes it, that I would argue does qualify as a forgery. So I've said a lot here just as an introduction. Let's hop into discussion and see what Bart and Hugo have to say.
The author never identifies himself. So why have people thought it was written by John, the son of Zebedee?
John has a very specific way of constructing its author. You can go through Mark, you can go through Matthew, you can go through Luke, and you'll hardly find a hint of the author, certainly not in Mark and Matthew. In the case of John, the author constructs himself in a very particular way. Right in the beginning, you mentioned the prologue of the gospel, that introductory section, verses 1 through 18. In verse 14, the author positions himself among the eyewitnesses to Jesus' life. He's identified with Jesus implicitly in the prologue. He says, finally became flesh, became a human being. And it says, and dwelled among us, and we have seen his glory. That us and we connection is really critical for the author. He positions himself as someone among the people with who knew Jesus, right, who interacted with Jesus, and says that he saw Jesus. So right at the beginning, you have this kind of sense that the author is one of, is situated among, speaks perhaps on behalf of a larger group of eyewitnesses. But what happens progressively through the text is one character begins to surface. He first appears in chapter 13, and it's a figure who's known as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And this is the only way the text speaks of this character.
That's the one that people generally call the beloved disciple, which is kind of a shorthand way of saying it.
And that's the figure that's going to become not only a central interest of the book's narrative, he's going to keep popping up in very prominent roles, but the text is also going to imply that this figure, is in fact the singular author of the text, who, if you will, is penning the text, perhaps on behalf of or condensing the eyewitness testimony of more figures.
So if we go back to the beginning of that little segment, you'll notice that the question Bart actually asked Hugo was, why do people think that this gospel was written by John, the son of Zebedee? It was a kind of an interesting response from Hugo, but he didn't actually answer the question of why people thought it was written by John, the son of Zebedee. I think this is kind of be a point that's going to be sticking out here. To this day, there's a lot of dispute over whether this character that Hugo's described, this beloved disciple, is in fact supposed to be John, the son of Zebedee. I know there's various opinions on that. Richard Bauckham, in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, argues that John should actually be identified with a different John, known as John the Presbyter or John the Elder, who has a relationship with Papias and also, I believe, Polycarp, kind of to the apostolic fathers that are more prominent in the very early part of the first century. So the ultimate question of whether or not this is this beloved disciple is indeed John, the son of Zebedee. We're going to kind of push off that part of the discussion and jump into the question of whether or not the narrator of the gospel is the same person as the beloved disciple. And that's the next question that Bart asked Hugo to kind of weigh in on.
Where in the gospel does it say that, does the author who's talking about the beloved disciple identify himself as the beloved disciple?
Yeah, so there are two verses that are really important for that particular identification. The first is 19:35. He says, earlier Jesus says that all his disciples will abandon him, but the beloved disciple has stayed with Jesus to the end, and he's standing under the cross. It's within that scene that the author describes a supernatural, unexpected event. Jesus has his side pierced by a spear, blood and water rush out. But because this is a very unusual detail, the author, almost kind of self-conscious about that, really tries to stress the credibility of the detail he's just given. And so in 1935, we read, "He who saw this has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth so that you may believe." If the book is supposed to be written from a we perspective of those who saw Jesus, then you'd imagine the beloved disciple is one of those figures. You get the strong sense when he's saying that he knows that he tells the truth, that since the narrator knows the interior states of this person's mind, it seems rather fitting that this person might be the narrator himself. He's saying that the testimony of this figure is given for the readers, that it has been given to the readers. And the entire point that this is so that the reader may believe actually fits with what you find in 2031 when the narrator states his own purpose in writing. A few chapters later, the narrator will say that he has that these things have been written so that you may believe, thus aligning what the disciple has done with what the narrator claims to do.
So Bart's asked Hugo, why do you think that the author or the narrator of the book is identifying himself as the beloved disciple when that's not kind of explicitly being made clear? It's a very good question. I think I've seen in other writings that Bart does not believe that the beloved disciple is presenting himself as the actual author, that a separate person is presenting himself as the author and then trying to relay the testimony of the beloved disciple. I think that's Bart's opinion on authorship. Hugo doesn't give a lot of reason to think that the beloved disciple is the author. He discusses like the state of mind, that the author knowing the state of mind of the beloved disciple, knowing that the beloved disciple is telling the truth. Bart's going to come back to Hugo here, kind of press him a little bit and see if he can kind of, defend the position that the author and the beloved disciple are the same person.
Why wouldn't it be just that the narrator is agreeing with the source that he has, that the beloved disciple saw this and he's telling the truth. He knows that he's telling the truth, and as opposed to like saying like, I saw this.
Yeah, I think it's that, extra piece, for instance, he's testifying that you may believe. I mean, I think that kind of address to the readers, it's suggesting that I think the author is much more clearly to be identified with this character. I think it's knitting the two together more closely. And it gets borne out in the reception history, right? So you can then read the next several centuries of Christian thought on this. And the reception history is quite clear that the figure who wrote this gospel is in fact the disciple whom Jesus loved.
So you see, when pressed, Hugo kind of makes this argument again about the author having the knowledge of the state of mind of the beloved disciple being evidence that they are one and the same. Bart doesn't really seem to be buying it. Hugo then shifts to an argument about the reception history. And this is kind of the history that the early church, the people who are reading this document, all identify this gospel with a person named John. Now, it's never super clear that John is John, the son of Zebedee, although I should state that is certainly a majority view. I wouldn't say uniform, but a large majority view of the early church is that the beloved disciple is John, the son of Zebedee. In any case, it's certainly the unanimous view that the beloved disciple is someone named John. So you can imagine here, reception history is not going to necessarily persuade Bart. He's going to kind of push back on this hard. We'll listen to what Bart has to say and then kind of analyze the discussion about the reception history and the value of that.
I mean, you put a lot of weight on the reception history. I mean, because, for example, the tradition history says that Mark was the disciple of Secretary of Peter. Mm-hmm. And so that's just as strong. And I mean, do you think the fact that people over 100 years later started saying that is good evidence? Or, I mean,
yeah, I don't think necessarily it was over 100 years later for the case of the Gospel of John.
Oh, really?
And I'm definitely.
Whoa, hold on a second. When was John first named as John?
So I'm Irenaeus, I think, is the one who gives us our earliest indication. My sense is that Papias does know the Gospel of John, and he's writing, I think, in the
he doesn't name it as
early
John,
2nd century.
He doesn't name it as John.
Not in the pieces of Papias that survive.
Right, but so I'm asking, when is the first name John? And Papias may have called it John. He may have called it Fred. I don't know. Right? I mean, is there a reason to think he named it John?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a clear reason to think that Papias named it John.
I just want to be clear about this. The first time it's actually named as John is Irenaeus.
Yeah.
It's usually dated 180 or 185.
Yeah, that's right.
So that would be 80 or 85 years later. So I just wanted to be clear that the reception history doesn't start like, the year after it was written.
This is where I really diverge on Bart's analysis of some of these things, and I have to question maybe potential bias that creeps into his analysis. He's arguing here that the reception history on the Gospel of John doesn't really start until we hit Irenaeus toward the latter part of the 2nd century. So just as a brief review, the Gospel of John is traditionally dated around 90 AD. Irenaeus is writing around 180, 185 AD. So this is, near a century later. And this is it needs to be said that this is not the first. Bart says this is the first identification of John. It's the earliest surviving identification of that gospel as being the Gospel of John. We know the gospel was out there, it was being quoted before this, and we have the Diatessaron, which is essentially a harmonization of the 4 gospels, about 20 years earlier, around the year 160. So the Gospel of John is out there. The Johannine Literature is being quoted. I don't think Bart would dispute that. I think he believes that John is being written close to the end of the 1st century, and it's out there, it's being circulated. We just don't have people, when they write about it, saying that this is the gospel according to John. Now, there is an issue about one of the very earliest church fathers named Papias, who only survived. We don't have direct writings of Papias. It's kind of one of the lost things of the church. It would give us, a lot of more history of what was going on right around the, beginning parts of the 2nd century. Papias his writings only survive by quotations that we find in Irenaeus at 185, and then Eusebius at the beginning of the 4th century, which is at a time when the church is starting to come into good graces with the Roman Empire and just growing in strength. So it's pretty clear to me that Papias did know the Gospel of John. Hugo is certainly arguing for that. One of the reasons, and Richard Bachman brought this up again in his book, one of the reasons to think that that's the case is that one of the surviving writings we have from Papias are just fragment of writing. Papias lists in his prologue 6 disciples: Andrew, Peter, Philip, Thomas, James, and John. Those 6 disciples are the 6 of the 7 disciples expressly mentioned in John's gospel. The only one who's missing is Matthew. And it's not just that Papias is identifying 6 of the 7 same disciples. He's also putting them in the exact same order: Andrew, Peter, Philip, Thomas, James, and John, as they're introduced in the Gospel of John. So the odds of that happening independently are astronomical. It's possible that both the author of the Gospel of John and Papias were both copying from some sort of previous source document where they're independently copying them from them. But it's, I think, far more likely that Papias just had access to John. There's tradition that he actually had spoken to one of the Johns. Maybe that's John the Elder, who some identify with John the son of Zebedee, and others identify as a completely unique person. I tend to fall into the category that John the Elder is a unique person. So Bart argues here that, Papias probably did know the Gospel of John, but he might have known it as the Gospel of Fred. And this is an argument he's made in the past. Problem you run into with arguments like this, that the Gospels are being circulated and with anonymously. We don't know who the authors are. There's no titles attached to them. This is the problem is every complete version of a gospel that we've ever found, and every version that we had the ending to, because titles were attached to the ending, has the title of the gospel. And the titles are generally just placed at the very end of the document, and it says gospel according to, or this is the gospel according to, Mark, Matthew, what have you. We've never found a a gospel or a gospel fragment with the ending that lacks that title. So in the internal text, yes, we don't have the author saying, "Hi, my name is Mark," or "Hi, my name is Matthew." But whenever we found the documents themselves where you would have a title, the titles would always be there as a kind of an independent attestation of who the author was. Now, these are later often, so I can see why Bart is skeptical of this, but you can just start to run into what kind of problems you run into when you're trying to place the authorship titles to a document a century after they were written. And the problem is, for example, Papias is supposedly in the area of Hierapolis near Greece. Other people who have like Irenaeus is in Lyon, so he's in southern France or central France. We have other people discussing the Gospel of John in Alexandria, where we have the earliest fragment of John, and that's survived, and then obviously Rome as well. No one is ever, when they're discussing this gospel, if they name it, no one is ever saying, "Oh, this was the gospel according to Fred," or any other person. Whenever there is a author that is named by one of these early church figures as being identified or associated with the work, it's always the same. And that's the case amongst each of the four gospels. We just don't have competing claims to the authorship from that time. So yes, you might have a case where someone is debating on who John is, but everyone is agreeing that the gospel is being attributed according to John, nobody else but quote unquote John. And that's the case with Mark and Matthew and Luke as well. So it's hard to just imagine a scenario where you have this very diffuse church that's existing all throughout the Mediterranean. I guess you could probably argue during the 2nd century that the area of Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, is the most powerful region, but it doesn't necessarily have the most pull. Rome has a lot of pull. There's obviously, the church is spreading into France, and Alexandria in Egypt is very important as well. And that's where because of the dry climate there, that's where a lot of the surviving textual fragments of the New Testament documents are coming from Alexandria. So when you have a church that's just diffuse, and there's no internet, or people, there's no Pony Express, people are communicating, it takes months over time. If to add, and there's no central authority, I should add that too, to add on to this some sort of mechanism by which we're going to have an author ascribed to a work late after this work has been circulating all throughout the Roman Empire, and then we're going to somehow attach an author to it late in the process. We should see evidence of competing author names at that point. We should see people saying, "Oh no, this is a gospel according to a different person." And one of the reasons we should see that is because we know that the four gospels are circulating by then. I mean, in fact, with the Diatessaron, we know that we have 4 different gospels circulating because they are harmonized in the Diatessaron in around the year 155. So, and Papias is, in the year, 107, or whenever Papias is writing, he clearly identifies Matthew and Mark as independent gospels. I know there's a disputer of these are the same Matthew and Mark. I mean, I think it's almost impossible to imagine that he just came up with these 2 names, Matthew and Mark, and they were completely different documents, especially the name Mark, which is not a Jewish name. It's a Greco-Roman name. So to just come up with this name Mark, and there just happened to be another gospel with the name Mark, completely different than the one we have, is kind of beggars belief. The odds of that are astronomical. So we know that these gospels were circulating at that time, in the very, right around the time of the turn of the century, probably earlier for the other 3 gospels. And to identify one and distinguish them from another, you're going to have an identifier, a name. That's how we distinguish between different books. If you have a library, you can't just say, "Oh, please give me the book." You need a title for that book. So it's almost impossible to imagine that these works were being circulated without titles. at any time in their history, and certainly 100 years in, you would see competing titles. You would see competing names of authors, and we just have there's just no evidence for that. So I think if you take the body of evidence here, it's hard to believe that John was being circulated under a different name. So to the extent you want to accept the reception history, I think you have to accept the reception history with the understanding that these works were immediately being attributed to specific authors. I know Bart rejects this, and I know that's been a kind of a central argument that he's been making for almost 20 years now. I just don't buy it, and I don't think it works. And we don't really have any example of something like this ever working, where you're having one piece of work circulating through a broad region. The Roman Empire was very large, and circulating through this broad region with no title or competing titles. I mean, when a book has no title, someone's going to give a title to it. So you're going to immediately start getting competing titles in different regions if there's no title. I just don't buy it. I don't think there's any example of it in history. I think it's just an argument that's never worked. So when Hugo's talking about the reception history and everyone identifying the work with John, I actually think that's persuasive. I think that's the best argument, quite frankly. I don't like the argument that he's making that the author of the book seems to have read the mind of the beloved disciple. I actually think at this stage of the argument, it's very credible to say that the beloved disciple is John, but the author is a different person who's going to rename himself anonymous, and the work itself, when it will be called the Gospel according to John, it's an according to the beloved disciple. That's kind of where I'm at in this discussion at this point in time.
John obviously has 21 chapters in our modern Bibles. One thing that scholars have appreciated through the last century is that there is something unusual about chapter 21 that suggests that it was probably added later to the gospel.
John.
Yeah, so if you read chapter 20 of John, you'll get all the way to the end, all the appearances of Jesus after his resurrection to his disciples, and you get a verse that feels at first glance like a very fitting conclusion to the book, where it'll note that there are many other signs that Jesus did in his life, but these are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Son of God, etc. So it's a fitting place to conclude the book. In fact, it's so fitting, it's exactly where the book ends again a chapter later. If you read the end of chapter 21, the point is made again that there are lots of other things that could be contained in this book, but are not. What follows in between those two seemingly redundant endings is a new passage of material that describes another appearance of Jesus that, for various reasons, because of its location between those two endings, because of the fact that it's at the end of the book, which is an easy place to potentially interpolate a text with additional material to actually insert new text, is what I mean by interpolation. And also just little features of that passage itself, scholars tend to think that this was probably added later.
Okay.
What's significant about chapter 21, whoever added this piece, is that they seem to have read the Gospel of John also in the sense that the disciple whom Jesus loved is probably the author here. So what you get in chapter 21, 24 to 25 is that at the end of this passage that has featured Peter and the beloved disciple with Jesus, you read the verses, "This is the disciple who is bearing witness to these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And there are many other things which Jesus did, were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that were written." So if you look at that verse closely, it's essentially a bricolage of language from 114, we have seen his glory, that piece, language from 1935, and language from 2031. He's combined pronouns too, in a gospel that refers to the disciple whom Jesus loved in the third person singular, who also has this third person plural we. The author has combined both of those at the end. He's also drawn in himself as an I. The disciple whom Jesus loved is the disciple who has written this text.
So here, in my opinion, is where Hugo's making his most elegant argument to associate the disciple that Jesus loved with the author of John. And he's arguing here that chapter 21, John, as we have it today, has 21 chapters. He's arguing that that final chapter, chapter 21, is being authored by a different person than the person that wrote chapters 1 through 20. And that he's telling you, the author of the chapter 21 is telling you that chapters 1 through 20 were written by the beloved disciple, which I think is an interesting and perhaps persuasive argument in the wording that we have there at the end of chapter 21. So let me talk a little bit here about if scholars are right about 21 being a later edition, what we should think about it, and one place where I think Hugo's argument kind of fails. So if 21 is a later addition to the Gospel of John, we kind of have to ask, when was it added, and was it added without proper, what we call, authorization? If 21 is a later addition, it's almost certainly the case that it was added very soon after chapters 1 through 20 were completed. And one of the reasons we would probably think that's the case is we've never found a version of John that ends with chapter 20 and doesn't have 21. Whenever we've had a complete version of John, chapter 21 is always in there. So this really brings up a question on the composition of John. There was a belief for many years, and I think many people still hold to this, that the Gospel of John was a product of the community that John reigned over, or was kind of controlled of. And that was part of the reason that John, the son of Zebedee, was associated with the gospel, that John, living very late into old age, was around to near the end of the first century, and had a community where he kind of presided over, was the pastor over the community, and that community produced the Gospel of John. I'm going to dive into a little bit of a rabbit hole here, because a lot of this stuff can't be proven, but there's a kind of some interesting aspects of John, which is John has always been considered the least factual of the four canonical Gospels. That's going to be addressed a little bit later. I think Hugo's going to make an argument based upon that, which I'll talk about. But the idea is that John is being written later than the three synoptic Gospels, has kind of a different portrayal of Jesus, much more portraying Jesus as understanding his own divinity in a way that's not portrayed in the synoptic Gospels. And this is a product of they're essentially putting a lot of words on Jesus's tongue that he never actually said during his lifetime, that would reflect his divinity. And those are some of the most famous lines of Christianity that are attributed to Jesus. And many scholars think that the author of this book kind of made those up. One of the kind of tricky parts about this is that in chapter 5 of John, there's a discussion about a pool near a sheep gate in Jerusalem called the Pool of Bethesda. And for kind of ever, this was considered a kind of a fictional creation of the author of John. It turns out that archaeology dug up a site where this pool was supposed to have been located, and the description of it fits very nicely into how the archaeological ruins match the description of John very, very nicely. The funny part about this is that apparently this pool was destroyed during the fall of Jerusalem and the sack of Jerusalem by Romans in the year 70 AD. So when this pool is discussed in John, it's discussed in the present tense, that the pool exists. And that's always kind of puzzled people once there was the discovery of the pool, that it actually did exist. So why would the gospel depict this pool as still existing if the gospel is being written in the year 90 and this pool has already been destroyed 2 decades earlier? It would be an interesting thought experiment to think, okay, well, maybe the Gospel of John was indeed kind of a product of the community that John is presiding over, in the later years of the first century. And they produced a gospel that was 20 chapters long. And then at some point in time, either John passes away or becomes very elderly. And then there is an addition placed to this. A final chapter is added. And that final chapter is added right before the text itself then starts to go into wide circulation. That, of course, involves a lot of speculation on my part, but it would kind of answer some questions. And it does help to explain, let's see, why you'd have this reference to, in the present tense, to the Pool of Bethesda, and why we have never found any copies of John that lack the 21st chapter. I think it's pretty unlikely that there was much circulation of John if it was with only 20 chapters long, if that even existed. And I could be persuaded that there was a shorter version, this version with only 20 chapters. I just don't think that went into circulation enough that we have any trace of it today. So now let's return to the question of, let's say the author of chapter 21 is a different person than the author of 20. Is the author of chapter 21 telling us that 20 was actually written by the beloved disciple? Is that just a belief of his? Could he be mistaken? Hugo is kind of implying here that he thinks that this additional chapter 21 is he's calling it an interpolation. And interpolation is really an unauthorized addition to a work. So he's arguing essentially that chapter 21 is not authorized. So I think there's tension there. If he's saying that some authors come around at a later date and is adding chapter 21 without authority, that author can also then be used as a source to tell us that chapters 1 through 20 were actually authored by John, or were authored by the beloved disciple, I guess I should say. One would think that somebody who lacked authority to add a chapter 21 would be in a position to tell us who the author of chapters 1 through 20 really was. So my guess here is that Hugo's partially correct, that the author of 21 is trying to tell us that the author of chapters 1 through 20 is the beloved disciple. However, I think he's probably doing it with some sort of authority of the community. And I think it's just highly unlikely that you would see this gospel get disseminated with chapter 21, meaning the source of the dissemination would have to be the person that did this quote unquote interpolation at the end. I think it's highly unlikely that it would be accepted if the dissemination was being sourced to a kind of a non-credible person, or a person who was circulating a gospel after, outside the community from which it was produced. I think it's far more likely that 21 is an addition with authority of the community. Perhaps at this point, the beloved disciple is passed on, but the community wants to add a little bit more before they put this gospel into circulation. I can't prove that, but that does make sense. There's also the question of whether or not, if the beloved disciple is John, or really any other of Jesus' disciples, would he be able to write in the level of Greek that we see in the Gospel of John? I think the answer to that on his own is probably no. He would not be able to pen the Greek himself. But if he's part of a larger community that includes, some Hellenized Jews and some Gentiles, people whose first language is Greek, I could easily see a scenario where you're attributing the authorship to this kind of elder statesman of the community who's telling you his experiences. He's the one who they will then say is the true author, but he's not, in a technical sense, penning the text himself. It's incumbent upon the other members of this community to kind of get his words and his vision onto paper in a way that has a high enough quality Greek that the work can then be transmitted to other communities and out through the rest of the Roman Empire. So I'm taking here what Hugo has argued for. I think he's making a persuasive argument. I'm putting a little bit of speculation on it, and I also think I need to push back a little bit on on the conclusion that this would be an interpolation, which would mean an unauthorized edition, if in fact we are going to say that the author of chapter 21 is some sort of reliable source for who the author of chapters 1 through 20 was.
Do you think the author then is making the implicit claim to be John, the son of Zebedee, or do you think this is an induction from that the early Christians make?
Yeah, I think it's more likely an inference of early Christian. When you think about ancient forgeries, ancient pseudepigrapha, texts that claim to be written by people they're not. In those sorts of texts, sometimes a little ambiguity is your friend. It ensures that a reader who might be skeptical of a direct claim might tolerate your book for a more implicit one.
So Hugo's finally now introducing kind of the main topic of this video, which is forgery, or what they call pseudepigrapha. Essentially, a work has been created to be portrayed as created by somebody else, and I described that earlier in the video. We're about to jump into the question of whether or not the Gospel of John qualifies as a forgery. We know that Bart's already kind of made that a staple of his book, that John is a forgery. Let's take a look at the central argument that Hugo makes, because he agrees with Bart that John does qualify as a forgery.
Just now use the term forgery, and many people listening to this or watching this will understand about that. But let's talk about it for a second. Could you just explain what you mean by the term forgery?
When I'm using the term forgery, I'm referring to an author who presents himself as someone other than who he is.
So whoever wrote this book didn't put a title, The Gospel According to John, on it.
Yeah. So if the work didn't have a title, if it doesn't have a direct name expressed, even, I mean, it's not a good candidate for this. So,
the author's claiming to be somebody that he's not. And in this case, the author would be claiming to be one of Jesus' closest, implicitly claiming to be one of Jesus' closest disciples. Is that?
Yeah, it's about a false authorial claim. I mean, an author who has accurately represented himself can lie, invent, exaggerate. There's no necessary tie between have you represented yourself clearly as an author and what contents do you present. The question of historicity is a different question than what's the authorial claim made in the text.
So you can see through that segment that Bart is kind of urging toward this notion of John being a forgery. And if you watch the full video, you'll see that more distinctly. Hugo makes two, I think, key points here. First, when addressing the definition of forgery, he basically says the sine qua non of forgery is a false authorial claim. The author claiming to be somebody that he is in fact not. The other key point here he makes is that forgery needs to be separated from the question of historicity, meaning somebody can, as an author, can be exactly who he claims to be, but can then present misinformation or factually incorrect information. Sometimes an author will place himself in circumstances or events that he was not actually involved in. The author's, it's not a forgery in the sense that the author is who the author claims to be. But in that particular case, we call that fabulism. And there's many famous occurrences of that. Jonathan Glass, who wrote for the New Republic, being a famous one. So we're going to head right into now the very specific issue of why Hugo is going to argue that the Gospel of John is indeed a forgery. Now, he's going to run into some complications here because he's just told us that historicity needs to be separated from the claim of authorship and whether or not the authorial claim is a fraudulent one. But then he's going to use historicity here as kind of like the centerpiece of his argument. And the other complication here is what we've been discussing for the first 40 minutes of this video, whether or not the person who actually penned the gospel, or at least chapters 1 through 20 of John, is in fact supposed to be the beloved disciple, or whether the author is just simply telling you that he is reciting to you the testimony of the beloved disciple. So the question of forgery is already complicated. Let's see how Hugo defends the position that John is in fact a forgery.
The author has claimed that he is an eyewitness to the life of Jesus, that he has spent time walking with, seeing Jesus. The problem is what he describes in his text. He presents Jesus teaching at length. The Gospel of John is full of very long discourses, long teaching sections in which Jesus articulates his views. And the views that Jesus articulates in the Gospel of John repeatedly, regularly, emphatically, are not the teachings that he presents in the synoptic Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. So in this Gospel, Jesus claims regularly to be a pre-existent being, come down from heaven, a celestial being. He presents himself as a divine being. None of these things appear clearly in the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. There's an entire image of human exaltation and transformation in this book that, you can start to try to coordinate this with Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and you're going to come up empty. Jesus is teaching a very coherent, very sophisticated, complex theology that may fit very well with Alexandrian Jewish speculations, maybe the thought of Paul and later Pauline interpreters, imitators, trends in second century Christianity, but it's not going to fit into the lifetime of Jesus and certainly Jesus's own teachings. If these were such important emphases in Jesus' teachings, one would wonder why they're not in Mark, Matthew, and Luke.
Right. So if Jesus is going around calling himself God or a divine being, you think they might want to mention that part. It's rather important. Yeah.
Okay, so having just told us that the issue of historicity has to be separated from the question of authorship, Hugo's primary argument that he goes to here is that forgery is evident by the fact that the account in the gospel is not historical. Okay, so we can already see this primary argument has a whole bunch of problems. Let's start from the standpoint of we don't actually know. It's widely believed, but we don't actually know that a number of non-historical claims are being presented in the Gospel of John. It is certainly true. It is certainly true that the character and the depiction of Jesus in John is it diverts. There's a divergence from what we see in the Synoptic Gospels. I think sometimes it's potentially exaggerated a bit. Certainly a lot of the discourses you hear in John, these long speeches and these kind of very bold pronouncements of Jesus' own divinity are not the kind of things we see in the synoptics. But there's, just from a strictly historical perspective, there's always the possibility that the synoptics miss this, and that the witness that is describing this in the Gospel of John actually has the correct information. But let's stipulate for the moment that that these things are kind of later embellishments, that he's adding material here. That doesn't really bear on the question of whether or not the author here, or at least the testimony, the underlying testimony, let's forget about the author, the underlying testimony itself is a forgery. And Hugo's going to continue to press this, but there's just a very central problem here, and he already identified it. He already said that you can have an authorial claim that is in fact true, and then that author presents facts that are not true. That could very well be exactly what we see here. And in fact, I'm not sure exactly why it's not. But we'll let Hugo kind of try to elaborate here and further build his argument. But so far, he's immediately running afoul of one of the kind of standards he just had set for himself to separate historicity from authorship.
When you said this ties into the authorship question, so are you saying that the author is claiming special authority for Jesus having taught these things? Because I'm one of the closest disciples, and I know he taught these things.
Yeah, I think the author is an author who is aware that the Jesus he's presenting is not the Jesus that is represented in other gospels. He has to double down on his own credibility as someone who is entering into, I think, a crowded field of gospel writing already by his era. I think there's some congestion there. I think that the author of the gospel is somebody who, at the very least, I mean, this is where we enter into the very dangerous ground of trying to perhaps enter into an ancient author's mind, right? But I think that the Gospel of John very clearly has resonances. The Jesus of the Gospel of John has resonances with the Jesus of the Synoptics, right? He uses a lot of the same motifs, images, shepherd, right? I mean, he'll draw on some of the same imagery. He'll talk of a kingdom. He'll talk of things like that. What Jesus does in John is, in effect, he reinterprets all of these things, where Mark, Matthew, and Luke are thinking, or certainly Mark is thinking of a kingdom here on earth. Jesus will say, my kingdom is not of this world. He will say that no one enters or sees the kingdom of God as flesh. One has to be born of spirit to even see the kingdom of God. He's transforming kingdom. He's transforming different aspects of Jesus's teaching in the Synoptics. So I think what the author had in mind is that I think he views himself as someone who is trying to set the record straight on what did Jesus mean when he talked about the kingdom, when he talked about eternal life, when he talked about any of the other things that he talks about in the Gospels.
At first you said that you thought it was deceptive what he was recording as Jesus' teaching, but then it sounded like you had a more kind of a sympathetic reading of it, that he's kind of interpreting in a new way the teachings of Jesus, rather than he's just making stuff up.
What the author imagines he's probably doing is giving you new invented material that becomes then the hermeneutical key, the interpretive key for everything you might read elsewhere in Jesus' tradition. So that, you might read another gospel. The gospels are all out there. You can't not run into them, except that the next time you'll read Mark, you'll either think that maybe Jesus didn't quite say it this way, maybe Jesus didn't quite say this, or maybe we've misinterpreted this.
In this segment, Hugo really gets much more into what I guess we would call the thesis, or his thesis of what is really going on with the Gospel of John, and what he's interpreting, or his understanding of the Gospel of John, is that the author has looked at the synoptic Gospels, the Gospels which have come before him, and is kind of reinterpreting or reimagining all of these events, and then adding new materials, maybe things that didn't, many things that didn't necessarily happen, and trying to use that to create like a new framework in what they call hermeneutics, a new way to approach the material, not just in John, but in the prior Gospels, the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's a persuasive case, and I think he's onto something. Certainly other scholars have touched upon this concept. Hugo's much more on the nose with it, and I have to give him credit for that. And I think he does a persuasive job of on his thesis about what John was really going on with John. Bart, especially if you watch the entire video, really wants to keep going back to the concept that the author of John is really deceiving the readers. Hugo will entertain that, but he's kind of moved on to other subjects. I think, though, if we take a step back and get to the original question here, which is, and just look at the name of the video, is the Gospel of John a forgery? The Hugo is not making that case persuasively, and neither is Bart. They're making a persuasive case that the materials in John are probably include quite a bit of material that is not historical. It's ahistorical material, and it is being presented in a way that the author knows it's not historical. That, however, is quite a bit different than proving the case that the authorship is a forgery, in the sense that the author is presenting himself as somebody other than who he really is. And the best argument for this was made by Hugo earlier in the video, when he said that the issue of historicity has to be separated from the issue of authorship. Has there been a persuasive argument made anywhere in this video? These are two of the top biblical scholars in the world. Hugo is one of the top biblical scholars on Johannine literature, so he knows the Gospel of John inside and out. Of course, Bart Ehrman, maybe the most famous biblical scholar in the world. Have either of these two men made a persuasive case, not that the material is ahistorical, but that the authorship is fraudulent, that the person who authored this is not who he said he was, whether that is the quote unquote beloved disciple himself, or whether that is someone purporting to capture or write down the testimony of the beloved disciple. And I think plainly, neither have made that case. They failed. There is not an argument here that I see, a persuasive argument. I'm not even sure there's an argument at all. I'm not even sure there's an argument at all that that John's a forgery. I mean, when you really drill down and say, what is the basis for the claim that John is a forgery, it's really based upon the ahistorical nature of the material in the book. But that doesn't mean it's a forgery. It just means that the book itself contains material, or arguably contains material, that's not historical. If we go back to something like Paul's epistles, there are epistles of Paul which recount his his encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. These are coming from epistles that almost every biblical scholar agrees is an authentic work of Paul. Yet they don't necessarily believe the historicity of these accounts of the road to Damascus. So there's no question about the authorship. These epistles are not forgeries. I mean, we're talking about the ones that are not disputed. But the accounts are not necessarily historical. That's a debate for scholars to make, and that's not something that's within our hands to prove one way or the other at this stage. So I think at bottom here, we've kind of reached a point where we've had an entire video. There's been a really interesting, in-depth discussion of this gospel, really strong interpretations, persuasive arguments made on certain points. But has anyone made a credible argument that the gospel itself is a forgery? My answer to that question is no. I want to make two final points before we adjourn. If Bart, in particular, and Hugo as well, wanted to make the argument that the Gospel of John is a forgery, I think that can be done. But there's certain ways that you'd have to do it. And I've thought about three of them. There might be others, but they're limited. There's not a kind of infinite way of going about doing this. So the three that I thought of, the first would be if we had some sort of contemporary evidence from the time that the Gospel of John was written, that there was a person or people claiming that the gospel was not in fact written by John or was not connected to the beloved disciple, that they knew who the author was and the author was not John or the beloved disciple or in any way connected to that person. That would at least be strong evidence toward a forgery, maybe decisive evidence. The second way you could go about doing this would be if we actually had proof that the Gospel of John was written at a later time period, in a time period where not only the quote-unquote beloved disciple would have long since passed, but his testimony would no longer be valid. It would kind of vanish from history. So if we could demonstrate, let's say that the Gospel of John was written sometime in the mid-2nd century, this would have been at least, let's say 60 years after the death of John, the son of Zebedee, or John the Elder, whoever we might think might be that beloved disciple, and any person who was alive during the lifetime of Jesus. If we could demonstrate that the book was written, at that period of time, I think that'd be very strong evidence as well. I mean, you can make a very strong case that the Gospel of John was a forgery. The third, and this would be maybe the most interesting, most convincing, is that if we had really strong evidence that we actually knew who the author was, and we may know this because we have writings from a different author, and stylistically and otherwise, the nature of the writing from this other author really matches the Gospel of John, and we know who this author is, and the author is not, in fact, John the son of Zebedee or the beloved disciple, any other person claiming to be the beloved disciple, or in any way connected to that person. So if we actually knew who an author of the book was, or had really good, strong reason to believe, and we knew it wasn't in any way connected to the beloved disciple, that would be a third way we could actually go about demonstrating that the book was a forgery. I think if Bart wants to continue with this argument, he's got to come up with evidence like that. He doesn't have evidence like that. This argument about it not being historical is not getting you there to actually demonstrate forgery. And that kind of brings me to my last point, which is, do we actually have good reason to think that the Gospel of John is a forgery? I mean, I guess we could, different minds, could have different thoughts on this. Maybe, whoever wrote it had no connection whatsoever to any supposed disciple of Jesus, whether beloved or not. But in thinking about this more deeply, and I think a lot of scholars actually agree with this, what if Hugo's hypothesis is correct here? I mean, it makes a lot of sense. What if what the Gospel of John is really doing is that it has the testimony of some person connected to Jesus? Now, Hugo's not really willing to go that far that this is actually a disciple, but let's say it is a disciple, and the Gospel of John is reflecting this disciple's testimony. And while the testimony is not true from a technical standpoint of being accurate, what it would reflect is kind of that disciple's deep reflection upon many, many years after the events, thinking things through, his interpretation of the events, and kind of reaching conclusions about that many years later, decades later. And the purpose of the Gospel of John is to kind of set the record straight from the synoptics by, as Hugo suggested, providing this kind of different hermeneutical lens through which we're going to look through those events. And in that way, the disciple viewed this gospel as reflecting a deeper truth. So I think Hugo's actually onto something here. He may not accept the idea that the ultimate source of this information is in fact a disciple of Jesus, but I think there's reasons to think it might be, given the fact that it was so, this is a work that's kind of goes into dissemination in the very late first century and is kind of adopted and accepted pretty quickly. And I think that's reflected by Papias accepting it, by the year, let's say 110. So I think there's a good reason to think that there is a disciple connected to this work. I'm not going to say it's John. I don't know who it is, but it makes sense it being John, considering that's kind of the universal tradition, and it's not contested with any other name. And I think Hugo's hypothesis makes sense, that what he's trying to do here is really soak in the events and come and trying to provide this kind of unique lens through which all the events that are described in the other Gospels and in John can then be interpreted. So thanks for listening, everyone. And those are Amerigo's commentaries.